Good afternoon, all. My name is James Spencer, and I will be giving you a presentation titled Providing Effective Programming and Services to Indigenous Library Patrons in Winnipeg. So moving on to the process of this presentation, the goal is to elaborate on how to better provide effective services and programming for Indigenous patrons, from where I will shift the focus to locally for Winnipeg libraries. I'll be analyzing this situation holistically, starting from the very top, the policy level, in which Indigenous peoples and policymakers work together in consultation. Second, I will examine specific cases from libraries across the nation that have met with great success in providing effective services and programs to their Indigenous patrons. From here, I will also be analyzing the current policies of Winnipeg libraries of all types, and in my opinion, many of their policies do not meet the programming and services needs as effectively as those found in the case studies. Then I will create suggestions based on insights gathered from these policies and case studies, which can go to improve greatly services and programming for Indigenous library patrons in Winnipeg. These suggestions will in turn allow for Winnipeg Library staff members to provide better programming and services for Indigenous patrons versus the framework that currently exists. If you were to ask most Canadians what they value the most about their society, you'd likely hear several recurring themes. You'd hear egalitarianism, inclusivity, multiculturalism, fairness. However, the Indigenous peoples of Canada have long been excluded from contemporary Canadian society. Due to the lingering legacy of colonialism in this nation's highest offices, these people have suffered discriminatorily through unhonored treaties, pandemics, several attempts at destruction of their culture, and even to this day, they continue to receive lesser access to virtually all basic services that most non-Indigenous Canadians take for granted. However, in this century, several government initiatives and policies have been enacted with the direct consultation and participation of Indigenous peoples in the legislation process. This principle of consultation and participation with Indigenous peoples is a dramatic shift from the historically inclusionary policies regarding Indigenous rights and matters in Canada. If this shift in ideology is maintained in Canada's government and institutions, it will hopefully lead to real progress for Indigenous rights and ideally help suture the rift that still exists in our modern Canadian society. As members of the library profession, it is our duty to serve the needs of our communities in the most egalitarian fashion possible. Thus, it is crucial that library staff become champions for the cause of equality, the just equality for all groups of people that comprise our Canadian communities. In our city of Winnipeg, Indigenous peoples comprise a significant portion of the population, about 12%, which is the highest of any Canadian city. So, moving on to policies. In the landmark document Calls to Action by the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, there are several calls to action pertaining to libraries. Call 66 requests that the federal government establish, quote, multi-year funding for community-based youth organizations to deliver programs on reconciliation and establish a national network to share information and best practices, unquote. Call 69 states, quote, we call upon Libraries and Archives Canada to fully adopt and implement the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the United Nations Journée Orient Liquor principles as related to Aboriginal peoples' inalienable rights to know the truth about what happened and why with regard to human rights violations committed against them in the residential schools. Part 2, ensure that its record holdings related to residential schools are accessible to the public. Part 3, commit more resources to its public education materials and programming on residential schools, unquote. This last point is of crucial importance, for the public education system in Canada has historically provided a very distorted perception to its students regarding residential schools and, by extension, Indigenous culture. If we are to better serve Indigenous library patrons, it would be best if every member of our society were aware of the several issues regarding their rights and freedoms. For instance, I graduated high school in 2011, and we rarely covered Indigenous materials in school. Our school library had very little Indigenous materials and no Indigenous-centered programming whatsoever. When we did cover residential schools, it was very brief and was told primarily from the colonizer's perspective, which left out the heart of the matter entirely. It wasn't until I was studying at the University of Winnipeg when I took several Indigenous history courses where I was first able to review materials that accounted for the Indigenous perspective of this issue. By the time I had earned my Bachelor's of Arts in History in 2017, I was awakened by this damning flaw in our city's primary public education system. If our school and public libraries in Winnipeg can correct this issue, ideally at all levels by instituting the aforementioned calls to action, it will not only provide better services and programs to their Indigenous patrons, it will also illuminate all patrons to Indigenous matters and hopefully lead to healing the rift that currently exists between Indigenous peoples and most government-sponsored institutions within Canada. Moving on to another policy, the CFLA, in association with the Indigenous Matters Committee, echoes the values of the previously mentioned policy in their 2017 document titled Reports and Recommendations, published in consultation with their very own Truth and Reconciliation Committee. These organizations ensure that Canadian libraries will promote reconciliation efforts and by establishing an authority and sensitivity of information pertaining to Indigenous peoples. The hierarchy of the Indigenous Matters Committee is one that is in line with the Indigenous worldview. The framework is akin to the medicine wheel, with the leadership comprising of elders and traditional teachers. The chair of this committee will also be the Indigenous representative to the CFLA's board of directors. The CFLA is the Canadian Federation of Library Associations. The chair may also invite individuals with valuable insights and credentials to sit on the Indigenous Matters Committee, such as elders and other respected Indigenous individuals. This example of integration of Indigenous peoples, this example of integration of Indigenous hierarchy concepts, combined with the collaboration of Indigenous peoples in the decision-making processes across all these organizations, is exactly what is needed to ensure that Indigenous patrons will receive proper services and programming in Winnipeg libraries. Moving on to the next slide. I'll be examining a program used by other libraries in this country. One example is the Storyteller in Residence, which could be definitely used in Winnipeg public libraries. This program was first adapted by the Vancouver Public Library. The Winnipeg Public Library does have Indigenous storytelling programs, but not nearly to this extent, however. The mission of this program is to foster a positive relationship between the library and local Indigenous peoples. These storytellers work in a Vancouver Public Library branch in 4-month increments from where they perform stories primarily in Indigenous languages and lesser so in English, from where they will rotate to a new branch after this 4-month period is over. In fact, one storyteller, who is also a hereditary chief after working in this program in the Vancouver Public Library for a couple of years, had mastered his native tongue to the extent that he felt confident enough to speak in his native language in public addresses. This was the first time in his life that he ever felt this confident to do so. In my opinion, there is a desperate need for programs such as these in Winnipeg libraries. For starters, Indigenous patrons will feel more at ease and will likely visit libraries more frequently if there are programs that are designed with their culture and languages in mind. The Millennium Library is the only Winnipeg library that hosts an Indigenous storyteller, albeit in a much smaller capacity. Also of note, if you've ever visited the Millennium Library, you've seen firsthand that it is far from an inviting institution, primarily due to its strict security measures. From my experience speaking to Indigenous friends and classmates, there also appears to be a significant cultural disconnect between urban Indigenous peoples and rural Indigenous peoples in terms of language use, which also validates the earlier claims made by the Vancouver Public Library storyteller. Several friends and classmates have relayed to me how their relatives in the country could speak their Indigenous languages fluidly, whereas my friends and peers from the city stated that they could barely understand the words. From my peers' anecdotes, I have witnessed a correlation. Indigenous languages are almost never used in urban homes, but only when Indigenous people visit their extended families in rural areas. This correlation reveals a strong need in Winnipeg to preserve and reintroduce Indigenous languages within our urban communities. The Winnipeg Public Library could be in the forefront of this battle. Winnipeg libraries can help stem the tide of this dissolution of Indigenous language and culture by adopting this programming model used by the Vancouver Public Library, but adapted to better suit our local Indigenous cultures. For instance, the Winnipeg Library could allow for smudging during these storytime sessions. Smudging is a vernacular term for the burning of sage, a sacred and purifying act shared across several Indigenous peoples of the Great Plains. Lastly, I would also suggest that the WPL follow the VPL's model and extend this service to multiple branches, especially to ones with higher Indigenous patron demographics, to better serve the entirety of Winnipeg's Indigenous library patron community. Next slide. As for a case of exemplary library services for Indigenous patrons in Canada, we shall look to Vancouver once again. However, in this instance, we will be examining an academic library with the intention of adapting for use in our local post-secondary institutions. A center for academic, the Weewa Library is a center for academic and community Indigenous scholarship. It is the only library of its kind in Canada to use an Indigenous approach throughout their programming services, research methods, and collections. Their collection holds over 12,000 items, including 6,000 books and thousands of online documents, such as peer-reviewed articles. As for reference services, this library offers dozens of research guides for UBC students on a multitude of Indigenous subjects. For instance, there are guides for Indigenous research methodology and another one for Indigenous librarianship, to name a few. The Indigenous Librarianship Research Guide, under its featured resources, contains a PDF file of the previously mentioned CFLA's Truth and Reconciliation Report and recommendations. This library is also one of a rare few that uses a variation of the Brian Deer classification system. Rather than being organized alphabetically, it is organized geographically. This organizational philosophy is in line with the Indigenous worldview. In most Indigenous societies, the land is considered sacred, thus it plays an integral role in Indigenous culture. The LC classification system, or Library of Congress classification system, has several shortcomings for serving Indigenous patrons, which the Brian Deer system has corrected. Firstly, several subject headings use the outdated and derogatory term of Indian, which is still widely used in the US to describe Indigenous peoples. Although still the preferred term for some Indigenous groups in the United States, this term is considered offensive by all Indigenous peoples in Canada and has been for quite some time now. Since most universities in Canada still use the Library of Congress classification system, these institutions still classify Indigenous peoples in derogatory terms. This will most likely offend most Indigenous academic library patrons to some degree. And in my opinion, this constitutes like the worst possible library service by describing in your institution a group of your own patrons in a very derogatory manner. It's very off-putting. Secondly, the alphabetical organization of LC does not meet the reference needs of Indigenous patrons as well as the Brian Deer classification system. The geographic organization of the BDC was particularly helpful for Indigenous patrons because a significant portion of research in Indigenous issues pertains to geographic issues such as land rights and resource management. I would strongly suggest UW and U of M attempt to model their library policies around the ones used in the WYWE library, which will provide far more effective library services to Indigenous patrons than previously. U of M and UW do have Indigenous collections, but not to this depth and breadth. In the very least, these institutions could adapt the Brian Deer classification system specifically for their Indigenous collections, which will provide much better service to Indigenous academic library patrons in Winnipeg. For Brian Deer classification does not use derogatory terminology. Now to conclude my presentation, in the last decade, our country has come a long way to help mend the fractured relationship in In the last decade, our country has come a long way to help mend the fractured relationship between Indigenous peoples and contemporary Canadian society. The consultation and participation of Indigenous peoples in the policy-making process has allowed for a greater representation of these peoples and their specific needs within Canadian society. However, this relationship has been fractured for centuries, so the process of reconciliation in our society will likely take several generations as a result. As bastions for our communities, Canadian libraries will play an integral role in the reconciliation process through providing more effective programs and services for Indigenous patrons than in the past. It is also vital that Canadian library staff research exemplary programs and services from other libraries across the nation with the intention of adopting or adapting these programs and services for their local libraries. To conclude, as library staff members, it is of vital importance that we continue this multifaceted process that allows for the creation of more effective programs and services for Indigenous patrons into the foreseeable future. If we want these changes to maintain over time, this is what we'll have to do. We'll have to continue this process. Thank you for your time, miigwech, and next slide for my works cited, and yeah, have a good day.